Thank you very much, Bob. It's nice always to be here. I see my colleague John Musso in the back of the room. He's now the Chief Investment Officer at Cumberland. I'm the Chief Annoyance Officer. You know, Bob, of all the introductions I've had in over half a century, that one was the most recent. There's a handout. The handout, I unfortunately apologize, there's just not enough copies for the room. Why? Because when I cobbled it together in a hurry, the printer jammed at number 15. So I'm going to ask everybody to pass it around. I did not have time to put it into a slide, but there's a couple of quick numbers. The purpose today, in a few minutes, is to contrast pandemics and the costs, the economics of an epidemic, pandemic, and a plague with a hurricane or other natural disasters. I have some slides. I'm going to go through a couple of them. Are they up?
Yep, they're up.
What did I do? I just turned off the slides. That's good. There it is. Okay. So there's a new book. Some of you know about it. Some of you have seen it. Some of you are maybe seeing this for the first time. It took us about 4 years of hard work. Wonderful co-authors helped me with it. Without them, this book wouldn't have occurred. And in it, we took COVID, which was a start, and we took the economics of it and the Federal Reserve's response, and we combined the examination of a pathogen, an attack, with economics. What happens to interest rates and wages and inflation and asset prices and real estate prices and stock market, bond market. So that was the trigger for the book. The book was triggered by a research paper that was published in the San Francisco Fed in very early 2020. Triggered by the Federal Reserve to examine what COVID could mean. This was a very early research paper. It had been worked on as soon as COVID there was an awareness that it was possible. And all of the Federal Reserve history having to deal with pandemics since the 1918 Spanish flu are in the book. There's about a section, that section on the Federal Reserve in the book is a book in itself. We went beyond that, so there's an entire historical section on all the way back to the plague in Athens and on antiquity, and there's a whole graphic economic situation in the book. I only want to go to a couple things from the book because today the task in a few minutes is to contrast hurricanes and pandemics. In your handout, I pulled out 5 years. 2020, that was when COVID started, 2021, 22, 23, and 24. You saw a summary of hurricanes in 2024. Official deaths in 2024 from hurricanes was 335. Now, it's a tragedy when somebody gets killed. We don't like to see it. 335 people died from hurricanes in 2024. Maybe more, but that's the official number. In 2023, 3 people died from hurricanes. 2022, 116. 2021, 68. In 2020, I could not find a single hurricane death. Those are the 5 years. Those are the deaths from hurricanes. I'm going to read COVID numbers. These are the official COVID numbers. 2024, a huge hurricane year. 47,000 people died officially from COVID. 2023, 76,000. Officially, I'm rounding numbers. 2022, 245,000. 2021, 460,000. 2020, 385,000. The biggest year property damage that we have, official number, is 127 billion last year because we had those three major storms. 127 billion. What was it in the year before? 4 billion. What was it in the year before that? 15 billion. What was it in 2021? 9 billion. 2020, 17 billion. Billion with a B. Cumulative total economic cost of COVID-19 for the 5 years, revised numbers, 18 trillion. So if you look at a hurricane, hurricanes, all hurricanes, and you compare them with the pandemic, COVID, one pandemic, we're all familiar with it. The gap is enormous. There's no Federal Reserve response to a hurricane. Why? It's not big enough. What does the Federal Reserve do? They do observe, they have a policy. All the hurricanes we've been talking about are really in one Federal Reserve district. There are 12. That's the Atlanta Fed. The Atlanta Fed is worried about the banks and the banking systems and the credit exposure that it has to sea level rise and hurricanes and damage. And that is as part of its supervision. You notice that we had 3 major hurricanes. We had 127 billion in damage. We had huge uninsured claims, huge. Everybody in this room knows at least one case study of someone who had a significant loss that was not insured. If you agree with me, raise your hand if you know at least one case study. There you are. Multiply that in the 5 or 6 states, and you can get a sense of what the losses were, and now translate them to loans, other businesses, businesses which went out of business. How many people in this room know of at least one business that failed and didn't reopen because of the hurricane? Okay, translate that to the Federal Reserve, whose role is monetary policy and supervision and implementation of banks. How many banks failed in 2024? None. How many needed absolute assistance from the central bank of the United States in the 5 or 6 states that were impacted? None. So there's a vast difference between implementation and response to a hurricane from monetary money areas. Totally different than a pandemic. In the book, we enumerate all the pieces, every single program that the Federal Reserve implemented, why it did it, and how it worked, and some of them did, and some of them didn't. There's a whole section on the Federal Reserve. There is no section on this Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, about hurricanes, and for good reasons, reasons which we understand. In my career, I sat on an advisory committee that met at the Federal Reserve, and I happened to sit in a meeting with a member of the Federal Open Market Committee and 5 other people right after Katrina. And this member of the Federal Open, those are private meetings, they take place in Federal Reserve banks all the time. The members of the Federal Open Market Committee are asking for inputs from various elements throughout the community. In this case, the president of this Federal Reserve Bank went around the table and he said, what do you think? How should I vote? What should I do because of Katrina at the next Fed meeting? That was the question. The answer was, after fierce discussion, we had video images of the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. A couple of us had actually made a trip to see it. I was one of those. It's quite an experience. The end result was no change in national central bank policy. The entire damage of Katrina in all was possibly 1/2% of the GDP of the United States under the worst case. So, policy response, monetary, zero. Make sure the banks are sound. If a bank is in trouble, you help it. Notice Silicon Valley Bank. How many people in the room remember Silicon Valley Bank? It was a $200 billion bank failure, twice the size of the entire damage of all the hurricanes last year. So that's the difference in response. I want to get to a chart if I can. Oh, I'm going the wrong way here. I'm going to skip that. There it is. In pandemics, people die. Capital doesn't die. In all other kinds of natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes is a big one taking place in another part of the world, fires, and those of us who are in the West know what it's like to go through wildfire after wildfire after wildfire. You look at the impacts, what happens? A few people die, it's a shame, we would like not to see it, but what else happens? Capital is destroyed in natural disasters. We saw it in Milton. In pandemics, no capital is destroyed. So here's what happens. Real quick economic lesson. I'm going to skip through these because we're on limited time. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. What happens in a hurricane? Poor people lose their homes, or they lose something else. Their heirs are poor. The loss is tragic. Rich people can lose their home. They don't like it. It's not nice. We don't want to see that happen. But they have the resources to overcome it in a hurricane. And there may or may not be insurance coverage. What happens in a pandemic? Poor people die. Their heirs are poor, and they inherit what there is to inherit. Rich people die. Their heirs get richer. Now think about what I just described. People die, capital doesn't. Per capita wealth goes up. And where is it? It is more concentrated on those who had it before the pandemic. So the savings concentration goes up. Doesn't happen in a hurricane, different distribution, or a wildfire, or an earthquake. Pandemic is unique. It raises the savings rate, concentrates it in the hands of the wealthy, who are already wealthy, and the divide between rich and poor widens. What's been going on in the United States for the last 5 years? And it causes huge governance and political disruption. In our book, we identify the disruptions starting with Greece 2,500 years ago to today with COVID. In every single case, the same thing repeated, just more modern. What else happens? Pandemic. Pandemics trigger huge innovations. Why? Because people have to get replaced with new techniques. In the old days, it might have been a new way to wage war. In the new days, what is it? A new way to wage war. It's called a drone. When the pandemic roared through a century, the Italian city-states, it was new ways to attack the walls of the city-state. Second thing, what else happens? The least productive enterprise in a pandemic fails. It's left if you were a farmer, you had 10 fields. After the loss of life, you said, okay, I really only need 9. I leave the least productive field to lie fallow. What happens? Productivity per capita goes up. Now think about what I just described. Productivity per capita goes up after a pandemic. Wealth per capita goes up after a pandemic. Concentration of capital intensifies in the savings rate. And what do you get? You get a change in the neutral interest rate. That's a very complex economic concept, but this is the way it works. When you have a war, unless it's mass casualty war, when you have an earthquake, when you have a pandemic, when you have a fire, whatever it is, you have a change in the interest rate structure of the entire economy. And in the medium term, not the initial shock, but after the shock, in the medium term, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, the neutral interest rate goes up. Why? You have to borrow more money, you have to refinance reconstruction. It depends on what it is. You have a forest, you burn the forest. It's going to take 50 years to replace the forest over a medium-term change. What happens in the pandemic? It goes down. Productivity per capita goes up. Wealth per capita up. Divide. Concentration of savings. Neutral interest rate goes down. That's what makes a pandemic unique. You want to understand why the stock market rallied to 6,000 on the S&P 500? This is easy. The blue line was going down. Now you don't need to do the math. You just look at the color of the line. So, where are we? What happens in wages? Different effect. And in this particular case, in the rebuilding post the hurricanes, we have a secondary shock, which is happening to the labor force because of a change in policy. Now, I'll tell a story, and then how many minutes, Rick?
0.
0 minutes. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
No, you can tell one more.
I can tell the story. A group of us went to New Orleans, and we had 2 days of briefings after Katrina. We were in the World Trade Center in New Orleans. We had 2 people there from the Federal Reserve, several different folks from FEMA, from all the activity, and we spent 2 days right after Katrina. We toured the 9th Ward, which was terrible. In that meeting, the director at the time was giving us a briefing on the cleanup. And I said to him, who's doing the work? Who's doing all this work? And he said, 15,000 workers from Honduras. I said, really? I said, so now do you process them? Do you have withholding? Are they all here legally? Are they all entered into the United States properly? These are all agencies. And he said, I didn't hear your question, so I'm not going to answer it. 15,000. I said, why Honduras? He said, because they know how to work when it's humid, no air conditioning, and it's 100 degrees. And were it not for the labor, we would never get to clean up the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. My ears, before the hearing aids, heard that from the director of the operation to clean up Katrina. So labor and labor force and the role of labor force is a very critical element. When you have a shock, hurricane shock, Bob cited 400,000 trucks of trash, truckloads. Think about the labor force. So I'm done, I'm out of time. That's the best I have. The big difference between a hurricane and a pandemic. Thank you very much.